The morning the Alpha King's wolf looked at me, I was on my knees in the mud. Not by choice. Never by choice. I had tripped on the uneven stones of the eastern courtyard, my basket of dried herbs scattering across the ground like an accusation. Thyme and yarrow and crushed lavender rolled between the boots of guards and noble-born betas who passed without slowing, without offering a hand, some of them laughing softly the way people laugh when they've forgotten that the thing they find amusing is actually a person. I gathered what I could. My fingers were cold. The autumn had come early to Vordenmere, the great walled seat of the Alpha Kingdom, and the stone beneath my palms held the chill of something deeper than weather, something that had seeped into the very bones of this place over centuries of rule and conquest. The smell of wood smoke drifted from the great hall chimneys above me, and somewhere in the kitchens bread was burning. I could always tell what was happening in a place by its smells before I could see it. It was one of the strange little gifts I'd never asked for. My name is Ellie. I am 23 years of age, an Omega-ranked healer's assistant assigned to the castle infirmary. And I am, by the general agreement of nearly everyone who has ever met me, entirely unremarkable. I have pale blonde hair that I keep in a long braid because it stays out of my way. I have eyes that people describe as gray, though sometimes near a candle they look almost green, a detail no one has ever commented on because people rarely look at me long enough to notice. I wear a gray woolen cloak that I mended myself 3 times at the hem, and a linen dress the color of old parchment, and leather boots that are a half size too large because they were the only ones available when mine finally gave out last winter. I am not the kind of woman that stories are told about. I knew this. I had always known this. And on most mornings, I had made a kind of quiet peace with it. But the morning the wolf looked at me, everything I thought I knew about my own smallness began, very slowly, to crack. I had not expected the king's retinue to pass through the eastern courtyard at that hour. They were not supposed to. The eastern courtyard was a servant's path, the way taken by healers and bread carriers and water bearers, and those whose work kept the great machine of the castle moving without ever being seen. Kings did not walk this way. Kings took the grand corridor, the carved archways, the passage lined with tapestries depicting the victories of their ancestors. But I heard the sound before I saw them, a low, rhythmic thunder of boots on stone, the clink of armor, and beneath all of it, something else. Something I felt more than heard. A deep, resonant hum, almost like the lowest note of a war drum that pressed against the inside of my chest. I straightened quickly, clutching my recovered basket to my front, and pressed myself against the courtyard wall the way I had learned to do, making myself small, making myself part of the stone, hoping to be passed over the way a hawk passes over a field mouse, without striking because the mouse simply does not move. They came around the eastern archway like a storm that had learned to walk upright. 6 royal guards in dark leather and iron, their cloaks the deep gray of the Vordenmere crest, moving in precise formation. Behind them, 2 high-ranking gammas. I recognized Lord Cedric by his silver-streaked beard and the careful blankness of his face, and beside him young Sir Aldous, who was perhaps 25 and had the look of a man trying very hard to seem as though he was not trying at all. And behind them, him. I had seen Alpha King Dominic only twice before, and both times at a distance. Once at the Harvest Conclave ceremony where I'd been stationed along the far wall with the other healers, and once through a high window when he crossed the training yard below. Even from those distances, even reduced by height and glass and the general confusion of crowds, he had possessed a quality I had no proper word for. Not just authority, not just size, though he was tall enough that the others around him seemed diminished, built with a soldier's breadth through the shoulder, every line of his body speaking of a life spent in discipline and warfare. It was something more than that. It was the particular stillness of a creature that does not need to announce itself because the world already knows it has arrived. His dark hair was braided back from his face in the warrior's fashion, multiple tight plaits gathered and bound. And his eyes, which I now saw for the first time at something approaching a useful distance, were the startling pale blue of winter ice over deep water. A faint scar traced the line of his left jaw. He wore his leather armor without ceremony, as though it were simply his skin, fur-trimmed at the cloak's edge, the chest straps crossed in the old military style. He walked without hurrying, which somehow made everyone around him hurry more. He had not seen me. No one ever saw me. But the wolf did. I had noticed the animal only when the group drew close enough. A great wolf, nearly the height of my hip at the shoulder, its fur the color of charcoal and winter ash. It moved without a leash, without any restraint at all, padding at the king's left side with the calm certainty of something that knows it is exactly where it belongs. This was Shade, the Alpha King's bonded wolf, the creature whose loyalty was spoken of in reverent tones throughout the kingdom, whose instincts were said to be so finely attuned to his Alpha's will that the two sometimes seemed to share a single breath. Shade was looking directly at me, not the distracted glance an animal gives to movement, not the wary assessment of a predator calculating a threat. The wolf had simply stopped walking, in the middle of the courtyard, and turned its pale amber eyes toward me with an expression I can only describe as recognition. The guards continued for 2 more steps before they noticed. The gammas faltered. Lord Cedric reached instinctively for the hilt at his belt. The king stopped. He turned, slowly, without alarm, and followed the direction of his wolf's gaze. And then Alpha King Dominic was looking at me. The entire world went very quiet. I became intensely aware of the mud drying on the hem of my cloak, of the half-crushed sprig of lavender still clutched in my left hand, of the fact that my mouth had gone completely dry. Around us, the guards shifted uncomfortably. Lord Cedric made a small, disapproving sound, the sound of a man who has identified an irregularity and found it personally offensive. "That's the Omega healer," I heard Sir Aldous murmur to the lord beside him. "The one they say speaks to animals, the mad girl." Someone snorted quietly. They laughed. Not loudly, not cruelly for its own sake, but easily. The casual laughter of people who have classified something as harmless and amusing and forgotten that it can hear them. I had been hearing that particular laughter for 3 years. Since the first winter I had arrived in Vordenmere, shivering and newly assigned, and the stable cats had followed me into the great hall because I'd simply asked them not to sleep in the cold. Since the time I'd calmed a lord's frightened stallion by sitting with it for an hour, speaking softly, and the stable hands had told the story with wide eyes that were not quite awed and not quite kind. Since the healer's master, old Brennan, had caught me in the herb garden with a crow sitting on my knee, eating from my palm, and had said nothing, but had moved me to the furthest corner of the infirmary storage after that, where I was least likely to be seen by anyone important. I did not know why animals came to me. I had stopped trying to explain it. Something in them seemed to recognize something in me. Perhaps the particular quality of stillness I had cultivated as a survival skill, or perhaps something older than that, something I had no name for. I did not speak to animals in any magical sense. I simply spoke to them the way I wished people would speak to me. Honestly, quietly, without expecting them to be something other than what they were. Shade took 1 step toward me, and then another. The wolf closed the distance between us with the unhurried certainty of something that has already made its decision, and pressed its enormous head against my free hand. The courtyard went absolutely still. I felt the warmth of the wolf's fur against my cold fingers. I felt the slow, steady exhale of its breath against my palm. And I heard. I was almost certain I heard, in that ringing silence, Lord Cedric's sharp intake of breath, and Sir Aldous' murmured disbelief, and the sound of the guards exchanging looks over the tops of their helmets. I made myself look up. Alpha King Dominic had not moved. He stood at the center of his stopped procession and watched his wolf, the wolf that was known throughout 3 kingdoms for its selective wariness, the wolf that had never, in 6 years of bonded service, approached a stranger, press its head into the muddy hands of an Omega healer whom everyone had just finished laughing at. His pale blue eyes moved from Shade to me. The expression on his face was unreadable. Not cold, exactly. Not warm. Something between calculation and something else. something I did not yet have language for. "Your name," he said. His voice was low and even, and it carried the way a bell carries, without effort, reaching everywhere. My voice, when I found it, was embarrassingly steady. "Ellie, my lord, of the castle infirmary." A pause. "Ellie," he repeated, as though testing the weight of it. Shade pressed harder against my hand, and made a sound, not a growl, but something softer, something that none of the assembled guards seemed to know how to categorize. The king's eyes were still on me when he spoke his next words. Not to me, not quite, but not away from me either. "She will attend the morning council." Lord Cedric's composure cracked visibly. "My lord, she is an Omega, a healer's assistant, surely." "She will attend," Dominic said. Not loudly, not harshly. Simply. And that was the end of the conversation. The retinue moved on. Shade stayed beside me for one more breath, long enough that I felt the warmth of it settle somewhere in the hollow of my chest, and then turned and followed his king with the easy authority of a creature that has done what it came to do. I stood alone in the eastern courtyard with my basket of scattered herbs and my mud-stained cloak and the fading warmth of a wolf's breath on my hand. And somewhere above me, in the great stone towers of Vordenmere, a bell began to ring for the morning hour. I looked down at the lavender still crushed in my fingers. Its scent rose up, sharp and calm and unbothered by any of this. Whatever had just happened, I did not think my life was going to be quiet anymore. I did not sleep the night before the council. I lay on my narrow cot in the healer's dormitory, staring at the low stone ceiling, while the other women breathed around me in the slow, even rhythms of the unbothered, and I turned the king's words over and over in my mind, like a stone worn smooth by a river that refuses to stop moving. "She will attend the morning council." 4 words, spoken without explanation, without ceremony, without the faintest acknowledgement that they had just rearranged the entire order of my existence. 4 words that had earned me, in the span of a single afternoon, more attention than 3 years of quiet service had ever managed to produce. By the time I had returned to the infirmary, word had already arrived before me. That is the particular cruelty of castle life. News travels faster than people, always, and it travels without kindness. Marta, the senior healer's assistant, had looked up from her mortar and pestle with an expression caught between pity and something sharper. Wren, the youngest of us at 22, had simply stared. Old Brennan had said nothing at all, which was somehow worse than anything he might have said, because his silence had the weight of a man confirming a fear he had carried for some time. "You'll want to be careful," Marta had told me quietly, once Brennan left the room. She was a beta woman of perhaps 40, broad-shouldered and practical, with the kind of face that had once been pretty and was now something better, honest. "The council does not welcome surprises, Lord Cedric in particular." "I didn't ask to be a surprise," I said. "No," she agreed, "but you are one anyway." She had helped me that evening to press my second dress, the slightly better one, deep gray linen, worn soft with age but clean, and to rebraid my hair more neatly. She did these things without making them into a lesson or a warning, which was its own kind of generosity. Wren had sat on a stool nearby and watched with the wide, earnest eyes of someone witnessing history and not entirely sure how to hold it. "Do you think the wolf truly chose her?" she'd whispered to Marta, apparently forgetting that I was in the room. "She's standing right there," Marta said. "I know. I meant, do you think it means something? In the old ways, when a bonded wolf... Wren. Right. Sorry, Ellie." I had not minded. I had been wondering the same thing. The council chamber was on the 3rd level of the keep's north tower, reached by a staircase that wound upward through cold stone corridors, smelling of torch smoke and old parchment. A guard I did not recognize led me there at the 7th bell, walking 2 steps ahead of me without speaking, which suited me well enough. I used the time to breathe. The door was heavy oak banded with iron, and it opened inward onto a room that was larger than I had imagined. A long table of dark wood dominated the center, scarred with the evidence of countless maps laid and argued over. Candles burned to nothing, fists struck in frustration. The walls held iron sconces, and between them, the mounted battle standards of the houses sworn to Vordenmir, 7 in total. Their colors faded to the particular dignity of things that have survived a great deal. There were 8 men already seated when I entered. 6 I did not know by name, though I recognized 2 by the colors of their house cloaks. Northern lords, if I recalled the healer's charts of regional ailments correctly, men whose people dealt with cold weather fevers and the particular bone aches of altitude. Lord Cedric sat at the table's left side, his silver-streaked beard freshly combed and his expression arranged into the careful neutrality of a man who is angry but has decided to be strategic about it. Sir Aldous was beside him, younger and less practiced at concealment, his distaste showing plainly in the set of his jaw. At the head of the table sat Alpha King Dominic. He was not wearing his cloak. Without it, he seemed somehow both less and more. Less ceremonial, yes, but also more present, as though the removal of the formal layer had allowed something realer to surface. His dark braids were tied back, and in the yellow light of the council candles, the scar along his jaw caught the shadow in a way that made it seem like a deliberate mark, rather than an accident of warfare. His pale blue eyes found me the moment the door opened, and he did not look away while I crossed the room to the single empty chair, placed, I noted, at the far end of the table, nearest the door, which I suspected was not coincidental. Shade was there. The wolf lay at the king's right, its great head resting on its forepaws, its amber eyes half-lidded. When I sat, those eyes opened fully and tracked to me with an attention that was almost companionable. "Gentlemen," the king said, which appeared to be both a greeting and a signal, because the room immediately settled into the particular focused silence of men who are accustomed to being productive. "We will continue the matter of the Ashfen border before anything else. Lord Harwick." One of the northern lords, broad, weathered, with the look of a man who spent more time outdoors than in, straightened and began to speak about troop movements and disputed grazing lands and a village called Thornmere that had apparently been changing hands in the technical sense without anyone in it being consulted. I listened carefully, because listening carefully was the only tool I had available to me, and because I genuinely did not know what I was expected to do here and wanted very much to understand before I was expected to do it. Lord Cedric spoke next, fluently and at length, about the strategic value of showing force at the northern pass before the first heavy snows closed the roads. Sir Aldous added something supporting this. 2 other lords concurred with the kind of quick agreement that told me they had already decided what they thought before walking through the door. Dominic listened. He did not move much while he listened, a quality I recognized, the quality of someone who has learned that stillness is information, that a man who reacts to everything reveals everything. He asked 3 questions, each one precise enough that I could see the men recalibrate their answers as they spoke them. And then, in a pause between Lord Harwick's summary of provisions needed and Lord Cedric's counter-proposal for supply routes, the king said, "Ellie, what do you hear?" Every head at the table turned toward me. I felt the weight of those stares the way you feel the cold when a door opens in winter. Immediately, thoroughly, in every exposed place. Lord Cedric's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Sir Aldous looked briefly as though he'd swallowed something unpleasant. I made myself meet the king's eyes. "My lord?" "You've been listening since you arrived," he said. "I'd like to know what you hear." It was a test. I understood that clearly enough. What I did not understand was whether he wanted me to fail it or pass it, and whether those 2 outcomes were even as distinct as they appeared. I thought of Thornmere. I thought of the way Lord Harwick had described the villagers, as a logistical variable, a source of labor and supply, a thing to be factored into movement rather than consulted about it. I thought of the way a frightened animal behaves when the people around it are arguing about what to do with it rather than to it. "I hear a conversation about borders," I said carefully. "That hasn't yet included the people who live on them." Silence. Not the attentive silence from before. A different kind. The silence of a room that has been interrupted in the middle of assuming something. Thornmere has changed administrative allegiance 4 times in 6 years, I continued, because I had started, and stopping now would be worse than continuing. If the people there are anything like frightened animals, and I mean no disrespect by the comparison, only that I know frightened things, they will not respond well to a show of force. They will scatter, or they will side with whoever arrived last, simply because that is who is currently present. Neither outcome helps the border question. Another silence. Then Lord Cedric, with the precise, controlled tone of a man exercising tremendous restraint. The Omega Healer suggests we consult peasants on matters of military strategy. The Omega Healer, Dominic said, with a mildness that somehow landed harder than volume would have, suggests that frightened people behave like frightened things. I find that worth considering. Cedric's mouth closed. Dominic looked at me for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. There was nothing warm in it yet. I want to be honest about that, because the warmth came later, slowly, the way light comes in winter, not all at once, but in increments you almost miss. What was there instead was something more unsettling and more valuable: attention. Real attention. The kind that takes the shape of what it's looking at rather than the shape of what it expects to find. Shade lifted his head and made the soft sound again, the one none of the guards had known how to categorize. Lord Cedric looked at the wolf, then at me, then back at the wolf, with the expression of a man whose map of the world has just developed an unexpected feature, and who has not yet decided whether to redraw it or deny it. The council continued. I was not asked to speak again that morning, but I was not dismissed either. And when the session ended, and the lords filed out in clusters of murmured strategy, I rose to leave, and found that Shade had, at some point I hadn't tracked, moved from the king's side to mine, and stood now at my left, warm and immovable as a promise. 3 weeks passed before Lord Cedric made his move. I had been counting, in the way that cautious people count, not with anticipation, but with the quiet dread of someone who knows that a storm is gathering and has no shelter prepared. Cedric was not a stupid man. That was the thing about him that made him genuinely dangerous, as opposed to merely unpleasant. He was patient, and he was principled in his way, and his principle was this: the order of things existed for a reason, and people who disrupted the order of things, even accidentally, even by the simple fact of a wolf choosing to stand beside them, were a problem that required managing. In those 3 weeks, I had attended 2 more council sessions. I had spoken once more, briefly, about the medicinal needs of border garrison soldiers, which I knew from the infirmary records in a way the lords did not, and had otherwise done what I did best: listened, and stayed still, and tried to take up as little space as possible, while somehow continuing to exist in a space I had not asked to enter. Life in the healer's dormitory had changed in ways both small and significant. Marta remained steady. She was that kind of woman, a fixed point, and I had grown to rely on her steadiness, the way you rely on a known landmark when the path is uncertain. She asked me each evening what had been discussed, and I told her what I could, and she listened with the focused attention of someone filing information carefully away. I understood gradually that Marta had her own sources of knowledge throughout the castle. Servants, stable hands, the old woman who laundered the council lord's cloaks and noticed what came back stained with wine versus what came back clean, which told its own stories about what kind of meeting it had been. Wren had become my unofficial shadow. She was sweet-natured and prone to anxiety, and had attached herself to me with the wholehearted commitment of someone who has decided, perhaps unwisely, that proximity to an interesting person is its own form of protection. She began waking early to walk with me to the infirmary. She saved me a place at the servants' table. Small things, the kind that cost little and mean much. The other healers and castle servants navigated around me with the careful courtesy reserved for things they weren't sure how to classify. I was still an Omega. That did not change. The hierarchy of our world was old and deep-rooted, and one wolf's preference and one king's notice did not uproot it. But something had shifted in the texture of how people held themselves near me. A fraction less dismissive, a fraction more watchful, which was not entirely comfortable, but was at least honest. The animals of the castle, as always, were simpler about it. The kitchen cat still came to me. The old gray mare in the stable still pressed her nose into my shoulder when I passed. A young raven had taken to landing on the dormitory windowsill each morning, which Wren found deeply significant, and which I found simply companionable. I had not spoken with the king privately. I was not certain I expected to. He was a king, and I was what I was. And the council chamber was a formal space with formal rules, and what had happened there was, I told myself, firmly and repeatedly, a matter of practical utility. He had found my perspective useful. That was all. I told myself this with great conviction. I was not entirely sure I believed it. Lord Cedric's move, when it came, was elegant in the way that traps set by intelligent people are elegant. It did not look like a trap at first. He came to the infirmary. Not personally. Cedric would not lower himself to that. He sent Sir Aldous, which was almost more insulting, because Aldous was young enough that his condescension still had the rawness of something recently learned, rather than long practiced. He arrived at the infirmary on a gray Tuesday morning, while I was grinding willow bark with Marta, and he stood in the doorway with the posture of a man who considers the room beneath him and has not quite perfected hiding it. "The Omega, Ellie," he said. "Lord Cedric requests your presence. He has a matter of health to discuss." Marta's grinding did not slow. She did not look up, but I saw her jaw set slightly. "Lord Cedric is unwell," I asked. "He wishes to consult on a health matter," Aldous said, which was not an answer. I set down my pestle. "I'll come." Marta caught my eye as I untied my work apron. Her expression said several things at once, none of which could be spoken aloud with Aldous in the doorway. I nodded, very slightly, to tell her I understood. Cedric received me in his private study on the second level, a room that smelled of old documents and the particular dry ambition of a man who has spent decades accumulating influence. He was seated behind a broad writing table when I entered, and he did not rise, which told me everything I needed to know about how he had categorized this meeting. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said pleasantly, "Sit." I sat. "You are settling in," he said, "to your new visibility." "I am doing my work, my lord," I said. "Yes." He folded his hands on the table in the manner of someone who has prepared what comes next. "That is precisely the matter I wish to address. Your work. An Omega healer's assistant has a specific and valuable function in this castle. The infirmary, the herb stores, the care of the sick, these are honorable duties." A pause, weighted and deliberate. "They are not, however, the council chamber." I kept my hand still in my lap. The king, Cedric said, with a gentleness that was somehow more alarming than anger would have been, "is a great man who carries enormous responsibility. He makes hundreds of decisions each day, many of them in the space of a breath. Not all of those decisions require defense." He let the word breathe between us. "What I am suggesting, Ellie, is that there are those in this court who find your presence in the council disruptive, confusing for the natural order of things, and that confusion creates friction. Friction creates instability, and instability—" He spread his hands briefly, as though the conclusion were self-evident. "Does not serve the kingdom." It was beautifully done. There was no threat I could name. There was no command I could refuse. There was only the civilized suggestion, wrapped in apparent concern for the kingdom's well-being, that I should make myself small again. I thought about the frightened villagers of Thornmere. I thought about how Cedric had described them, as variables. I thought about Marta's steady hands and Wren's anxious eyes, and the way Shade's warmth had felt against my palm in the cold courtyard, like something recognizing something. "I understand your concern, my lord," I said quietly. May I ask, has the king indicated that he finds my presence in the council disruptive? A very small pause. The king's instincts are extraordinary. They are not always practical, I offered. Cedric's eyes sharpened. Contextual, he corrected. Then perhaps, I said, and I was so careful to keep my voice level and respectful. The appropriate person to address the question of my attendance is the king himself. The silence that followed had texture to it, the particular density of a silence in which someone is deciding whether they have been outmaneuvered or merely delayed. You are, Cedric said at last very quietly, either very brave or very foolish. I'm an Omega healer's assistant, my lord, I said. Most people assume the latter. I excused myself before he could respond. I was halfway down the corridor when I heard the footstep behind me, not Aldous, heavier than that, a different rhythm. And I turned to find that it was not a person following me at all. Shade had been waiting in the corridor. I did not know how long. He fell into step beside me without invitation, his shoulder nearly level with my hip, his amber eyes forward, as though we had arranged this. I looked down at him. He did not look up at me, but his tail moved, once, slow, certain. You were listening, I said softly. He did not answer, obviously, but he stayed beside me all the way down the staircase and through the lower passage, and only turned back toward the king's quarters when we reached the infirmary door, as though he had simply wanted to ensure I arrived safely, and having done so, his task was complete. I stood in the doorway and watched him go. Marta appeared at my elbow. Well? Cedric wants me to disappear, I said. She handed me back my work apron. And are you going to? I tied the apron strings, looked down at my hands, the hands that smelled of willow bark and lavender, that animals pressed their heads into, that a king had looked at with an expression I still did not have language for. No, I said. I don't think I am. Marta made a small sound that might, in a different kind of woman, have been called satisfied. Outside the window, the young raven landed on the sill and clicked its beak once, as though agreeing. The snow came to Vordenmere on the last day of the 10th month, earlier than anyone had predicted. I remember the morning it began because I was in the herb garden when the first flakes fell. A small enclosed courtyard on the castle's southern side, where the healers grew what they could in raised stone beds, protected from the worst of the wind by high walls on 3 sides. I had gone there before dawn to harvest the last of the autumn sage before the frost claimed it entirely, and I was crouched between the beds with cold fingers and a half-filled basket when the sky, which had been the heavy pewter color of a held breath, finally exhaled. The snow fell softly at first, then less softly. By the time I returned to the infirmary, the courtyard stones were white, and by midday the world outside the castle windows had gone quiet, in the particular way that only heavy snowfall achieves. A silence that presses down from above, muffling the ordinary sounds of life, until everything feels suspended, waiting. It was in this suspended quiet that the messenger arrived from Thornmere. I knew something had happened before anyone told me, because Wren came running into the storage room where I was cataloging the season's dried stores with an expression that had gone past anxiety into something paler and more serious. Behind her, I could hear raised voices from the direction of the great hall, not the argumentative voices of lords in disagreement, but the urgent, overlapping voices of people responding to news. There's been trouble at the border, Wren said, breathless. A messenger came in half-frozen. They're saying Thornmere. What happened? I don't know the whole of it, but the king has called an emergency council. She grabbed my arm. Ellie, they're sending for you. The guard who came for me was one I recognized from the council sessions. A taciturn beta named Oswin, square-jawed and reliable, who had developed the habit of giving me a single brief nod when we passed in corridors, which I had come to interpret as his version of warmth. He said nothing now beyond, "Come quickly," and I followed him through the snow-brightened corridors with my sage-stained hands, and my heart beating faster than I wanted it to. The council chamber was louder than I had ever heard it, 4 lords were speaking simultaneously when I entered, which meant no one was being heard, which meant the news was bad enough to have temporarily dissolved the careful hierarchies of who deferred to whom. Lord Harwick had risen from his seat and was standing with both fists on the table, his weathered face flushed with something between fury and fear. Lord Cedric was very still in his chair, which I had learned was his version of the same thing. At the head of the table, Dominic stood. He was not seated. He had the particular stillness of a man who is containing something large and has chosen containment over expression because expression would cost too much right now. His pale blue eyes moved to me when I entered, and something in them shifted. Not relief, exactly, but the particular quality of a man who has been waiting for a specific piece of a puzzle and has just seen it arrive. Thornmere has been surrounded, he said, to the room, and to me simultaneously. Not by our forces. Raiders from beyond the Ashfen. They came through the northern pass 4 days ago, while the garrison was reduced for the supply rotation. His jaw tightened briefly. 60 families. They cannot leave. The lords resumed their arguing. 2 wanted immediate military response. Send the garrison north. Break the siege by force. Harwick agreed with this. Cedric countered that sending soldiers through the mountain pass in fresh snowfall was how you lost soldiers, not how you saved villagers, and that the pass would be closed within 2 days if the snow continued, which meant any force sent now would arrive to find themselves trapped on the wrong side of the mountains with an unknown enemy. We don't know their numbers, Aldous said. We don't know their intention, whether this is occupation or leverage. If it's leverage, someone said, we'll hear their terms. And if it's occupation? Silence. I had been standing near the door, listening, watching the shape of the argument the way you watch the shape of a river to understand where it wants to go. I thought about what I knew of Thornmere from the infirmary records, the seasonal ailments that came through, the remedies requested by the village healer, a woman named Sura, who sent careful, detailed notes with every supply request, and who had, 3 months ago, written a postscript that had stayed with me because of its precision. The children here have learned not to cry when they are frightened. They have had too much practice at it. I thought about frightened things that had too much practice at it. They've been changing allegiance for 6 years, I said. The arguing stopped. Every head turned. I had not meant to speak aloud. Or perhaps I had. It was becoming harder to distinguish between the two. Every time the administrative control of Thornmere changed hands, I continued, steadier now that I had begun. The village adapted. They learned to read whoever held power, and to give that power what it wanted. That's not weakness. That's survival. It means they are watching the raiders right now very carefully, deciding what those raiders need to see from them. I paused. It also means that if someone they trusted sent word, someone they had reason to believe was not arriving to simply replace one authority with another, they would respond to it. Lord Harwick stared at me. You're suggesting we send a message. I'm suggesting the garrison isn't the first move, I said. A message first, from someone the village healer knows. A short silence. The village healer corresponds with the infirmary, Dominic said slowly. It was not a question. Her name is Sura, I said. She has written to us 12 times this year. She is methodical, and she is brave, and she knows her village better than any map does. Another silence, different in quality. The silence of people recalculating. Lord Cedric spoke. His voice was controlled, but something had shifted in it. What would the message say? That help is coming, I said. Not soldiers first, a healer. Someone who arrives with medicine and without weapons, who cannot be interpreted as an invading force, who gives Sura information about what follows. I looked at the table, then made myself look up. It would need to be me. She knows my name. I've signed every reply we've sent her. The silence this time had a different texture entirely. Harwick sat down heavily. It's dangerous, he said. The pass, the raiders. The pass is passable for 2 more days, I said. Probably. You said probably, Aldous said. I'm a healer's assistant, not a weather prophet, I said. Something moved across Dominic's face, quickly, gone before I could name it fully, but I thought, in the fraction of a breath it lasted, that it might have been the furthest edge of amusement. Leave us, he said to the council. The lords looked at one another. Cedric's expression cycled through several things, but they went, all of them, with varying degrees of reluctance, filing out through the heavy door until it closed behind them, and the chamber held only the sound of the fire and the muffled weight of snow against the high windows. And Dominic. And Shade, who had risen from his place and come to stand between us, equidistant, as though appointed by no one to hold the space. And me. The king crossed around the end of the table. Not quickly. He moved the way he always moved, without urgency, which somehow made everything feel more urgent. He stopped perhaps 4 feet from me, close enough that I had to make a conscious decision not to step back, and looked at me with the direct, assessing attention I had come to recognize as simply how he looked at things he was trying to understand. You would go, he said, to Thornmere, in the snow, with raiders. I would go, I said. Yes. Why? I thought about Sura's postscript. The children here have learned not to cry when they are frightened. They have had too much practice at it. Because someone should, I said. And I am the person who can. He was quiet for a long moment. The fire shifted in the hearth. Outside, snow pressed against the glass in soft, persistent silence. I will send 2 guards with you, he said at last. Oswin and 1 other. They will follow your lead on approach. No drawn weapons unless you say. I blinked. You're allowing it. I'm not allowing it, he said. I'm supporting it. There is a difference. I did not entirely know what to do with that distinction, so I simply held it. He looked at me for another moment, that particular attention, that quality of being genuinely seen rather than assessed, and then he said more quietly, the kind of quiet that is not for anyone else. Come back, Ellie. Not a command. The words had none of the flat authority of a command. They had something else in them, something that pressed against the inside of my chest the same way Shade's warmth had pressed against my palm in the cold courtyard. Unexpected, steady, and very difficult to dismiss. I looked at him. I intend to, my lord. Shade pressed his nose briefly against my hand. Then I turned and walked toward the door, and did not let myself look back. Not because I didn't want to, but because I understood. With the particular instinct of someone who has spent a lifetime reading the unspoken, that some moments are better carried forward than lingered in. The door opened onto the cold corridor. The snow was still falling. I had work to do. The road to Thornmere took 11 hours. I know this because I counted the bells from every village tower we passed. 4 of them between Vordenmere and the mountain's base. Their sounds muffled and strange through the falling snow, arriving late and softened as though the winter were trying to keep even time quiet. Oswin rode beside me without complaint, his broad face set against the cold with the stoic acceptance of a man who has been sent into worse. The second guard, a younger beta named Perrin, rode behind us and said very little, which I appreciated. The snow did not stop. By the 3rd hour, my hands, even inside the thick riding gloves Marta had pressed on me before dawn, standing in the infirmary doorway with Wren hovering anxiously behind her, both of them pretending they were not frightened, had gone stiff with cold. By the 5th hour, the path through the mountain pass had narrowed to something that required single-file riding and careful attention to where the edge of the visible road ended and the edge of nothing began. The wind came through the pass in long, low notes, almost musical, the kind of sound that makes you understand why old stories filled the mountains with voices. I thought about Dominic's words as I rode. Come back, Ellie. I had been turning them over since I left the council chamber, examining them the way you examine something fragile, carefully from multiple angles, trying to understand what they were made of. He was a king, He sent people into difficult situations routinely. He likely said things of this nature to soldiers before battles, to messengers before long rides, to anyone departing on his behalf into uncertain conditions. I told myself this. I was not entirely persuaded. We smelled Thornmere before we saw it. Wood smoke and livestock and the particular dense smell of a settlement that has closed itself in, conserving heat and keeping still. The village materialized out of the white gradually, the way shapes emerge from fog. First a roofline, then a fence post, then the dark mouth of a gate standing half open. No guards at the gate. That told me something. Slowly, I said to Oswin, "No hands near weapons." He nodded once. We rode in at a walk. The village square was empty of people, but not of signs of people. A cart left mid-unloading. A child's wooden toy half buried in snow near a doorstep. Windows with their shutters drawn, but light leaking at the edges. The presence of the raiders was visible in the way absence is visible. A cluster of unfamiliar horses at the far end of the square, tethered outside the largest building, which appeared to be the village gathering hall. 2 men stood at the hall's door, armed, watching us arrive with the wary assessment of people who have not yet decided what we are. I dismounted before anyone told me to. I handed my reins to Perrin and walked toward the hall alone. "Healer," I called out clearly in a carrying voice. "From Vordenmere Infirmary. I am here to see Sura." The 2 men at the door exchanged a look. One of them went inside. I waited. The snow fell on my shoulders, and on the abandoned cart, and on the child's toy in the drift, patient and indifferent. The door opened, and Sura came out. She was perhaps 50, small and quick-eyed, with the particular upright posture of someone who carries authority without having been formally granted it, the way village healers often do, because someone has to. Her gray hair was pulled back simply, and her expression, when she saw me, cycled through recognition and relief, and a carefully managed fear, all in the span of a breath. "Ellie," she said, "from the infirmary." "The same," I said. "I have your letters, all 12 of them." Something in her shoulders released, fractionally. She crossed the square toward me and took both my hands in hers. A healer's greeting, the pressing of palms, the old way of saying I am here, and you are not alone without words. She spoke quietly and quickly. 43 raiders, she said, led by a man called Vrath, who wanted not the village but passage. The old trade road through Thornmere connected to routes east that had been blocked by Vordenmere's patrol expansion, and Vrath needed that road. He had taken the village as leverage, yes, but he was not, Sura believed, primarily interested in destruction. He was interested in negotiation, and he had not yet found anyone with the authority to negotiate with. "He'll speak to a king's representative," she said. "He's been waiting for one. He thought they'd send soldiers." "They wanted to," I said. Something moved in her eyes. "But they sent you." "They sent me first," I said. "The soldiers are available if needed. But I don't think they'll be needed." She looked at me for a long moment, with the focused appraisal of a woman who has spent decades reading people's bodies for what their words don't say. Then she nodded once, firmly, the way people nod when they've decided to trust something. "Come inside," she said. "I'll take you to Vrath." I will not recount every word of that conversation, because some of it was technical and logistical, and the emotional truth of it is simpler than its details. Vrath was a hard man in a difficult position, leading people who depended on him, trying to force a solution to a problem that had been building for 2 years. He was not a good man in any uncomplicated sense, but he was a comprehensible one. And comprehensible things can be worked with. I told him that the Alpha King was willing to discuss regulated access to the Eastern Trade Road in exchange for the immediate withdrawal from Thornmere and a formal cessation of border aggression. I told him I had the authority to convey this offer, and that the king's word, once given, was kept. I told him that the alternative, which I did not describe in detail, but gestured toward with sufficient clarity, was considerably less comfortable for everyone involved. He looked at me for a long time. "You're a healer," he said. "Not a lord. Not a soldier." "No," I agreed. "Why did they send you?" I thought about Shade pressing his head into my cold hands. I thought about the council chamber and Cedric's elegant trap, and Dominic's voice saying, "I'm not allowing it. I'm supporting it." I thought about 12 letters from a village healer who had learned to be precise about fear. "Because I was the right person for it," I said, simply, without apology. Vrath was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Tell your king we'll hear his terms." We rode back through the night. The snow had slowed to something gentle by the time Vordenmir's walls appeared against the dark sky, torchlight glowing amber at the gates, and I felt the particular exhaustion that comes not from physical effort alone, but from having held yourself very carefully together for a very long time, and finally being somewhere that you might, cautiously, begin to let go. Oswin had said almost nothing the entire return journey. As we passed through the castle gates, he looked across at me and gave a single nod, but longer than usual, and with a quality to it that I understood was his way of saying something he did not have words for, or did not know how to say, or had simply never had occasion to say to someone like me before. I nodded back. Marta was waiting in the infirmary, awake at an hour when she had no reason to be awake, with warm broth and a fire built up, and Wren asleep in the corner chair with her head tipped back and her mouth slightly open. She did not make a fuss. She simply handed me the broth and sat across from me while I drank it, and when I had finished telling her the outline of what had happened, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "Good." Just that. Good. It was enough. I did not see Dominic until the following afternoon. I was in the herb garden. The snow had stopped, and the raised beds wore white caps, and the air had the crystalline quality of cold that has settled into itself and become still, when I heard his footstep on the stone path. I knew it was him before I turned, which surprised me less than it once would have. He came alone. No guards, no gammas, no procession. Just the king, in his leather and fur, his dark braids over one shoulder, his pale blue eyes finding me across the quiet white garden with an expression I finally, in that moment, had language for. Relief. Carefully held, but real. Shade moved ahead of him and came directly to me, pressing his great head against my side with a warmth that nearly undid my composure. "You came back," Dominic said. "I said I intended to," I reminded him. He stopped a few feet from me. The garden was very quiet. Somewhere above us, a raven called once and was silent. "Vrath's terms have been sent to the council," he said. "Cedric finds them surprisingly reasonable." "Cedric finds anything reasonable that resolves cleanly," I said. The furthest edge of that expression crossed his face again, the one I had glimpsed in the council chamber, and now saw fully for the first time. It was warmer than I had imagined. It changed the whole architecture of his face, briefly, into something less like a king and more like a man. "He has also," Dominic continued, "formally requested that your role be defined, in writing, with a title." I looked up at him. A title. Royal Council for Border Affairs and Intercessory Negotiation. He paused. "It is a title Cedric invented specifically so that your presence in the council has a name. And a name means a precedent. And a precedent means it cannot be informally withdrawn." Another pause. "I believe he is attempting to manage the situation. By making it official," I said slowly. "By making it official," he agreed. "Cedric is not a man who loses gracefully, but he is a man who adapts." I looked down at Shade, who was still pressed against my side, steady and warm. I thought about the last months, the mud in the eastern courtyard, the laughter, the long careful effort of making myself small enough to be overlooked. The council chamber, Thornmere, Sura's hands pressing mine in the snow. "And what do you want?" I asked. I had not entirely planned to say it, but it was the true question, and I had run out of patience for asking anything other than true questions. Dominic was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that is not absence but presence. The quiet of someone who is choosing their words not for effect but for accuracy, which is the rarest kind of honesty. "I want you at that table," he said. "Not because Shade chose you, though I have learned not to dismiss what he knows before I understand it. Not because you handled Thornmere, though you did, and better than I dared expect." He looked at me with that direct, undeflected attention. "Because you look at frightened things and see them clearly, and you speak to them without requiring them to be something other than what they are. This kingdom has many warriors. It has very few people who can do what you do." The garden was very still. "That is a great deal to ask of a healer's assistant," I said carefully. "It is," he agreed, "which is why I am asking, not commanding." I looked at him, at the scar along his jaw and the steady blue of his eyes and the careful honesty of a powerful man who had learned, somewhere in the long, difficult years of being what he was, that some things cannot be taken, only offered and received. I thought about the girl who had pressed herself against the courtyard wall and hoped to be passed over. I thought about how she had believed, for a very long time, that the best she could do was survive the attention of the world without being broken by it. I thought about how wrong she had been. "Then I accept," I said. Dominic held out his hand, not a king's gesture of command, but a man's gesture of accord, palm up, waiting. I placed my hand in his. His fingers closed around mine, warm and certain, and we stood in the snow-quiet garden while Shade leaned against both of us with the serene authority of a creature that has known from the beginning how this story would end. What followed was not without difficulty. The council required managing, as councils always do. The negotiations with Vrath took 3 more months, and the patient, careful work of many people, Sura among them, whom I brought to Vordenmere for the final accord, and who sat at the council table with the upright posture of someone who has never needed formal authority to hold her own, and said precisely what needed to be said, and went home to Thornmere when it was done. Cedric adapted, as Dominic had said he would, grudgingly, precisely, and eventually with something that was not quite respect, but was close enough to function as it. Harwick, to my surprise, became an unexpected ally. He was a practical man, and practical men follow what works. Wren became the senior healer's assistant, which suited her, and she stopped being anxious about quite so many things once she had enough responsibility to direct her energy into. Marta retired from the infirmary the following spring and went to live with her sister in the southern lowlands, and I walked with her to the castle gates on the morning she left, and we stood there in the new warm air, and she looked at me with her honest face and said simply, "Good," the way she had said it the night I came back from Thornmere, and I understood it to mean the same thing it had always meant, which was everything. Oswin was appointed head of my personal guard, a role he discharged with the same stoic reliability he brought to everything, and which he never once made a fuss about, which was exactly right. Dominic and I were married in the great hall on the first day of spring, with the apple trees in the courtyard gardens just beginning to show their first cautious blossoms, white against the cold blue sky. It was not a grand ceremony, in the way that royal ceremonies are sometimes grand, elaborate, performative, more for the court than for the people at its center. It was witnessed by the council and the castle household, and a raven that landed on the windowsill of the great hall and stayed there through the entire proceedings, which several people found deeply meaningful, and which I found simply companionable. Shade walked between us. That is the part people remember when they tell the story, that the Alpha King's wolf walked between the king and his bride, steady and certain, as though he had known from the very beginning where everyone belonged, and had simply been waiting for the rest of us to catch up. Perhaps he had. I think about the girl in the eastern courtyard sometimes, the one with the mud on her cloak, and the lavender in her hand, and the sound of easy laughter still in her ears. I think about how she believed the best possible version of her life was one in which she was not noticed, not troubled, not required to be anything that might draw the wrong kind of attention. I want to tell her that she was not wrong to survive the way she did. Survival is not nothing. Survival is where everything else begins. But I also want to tell her what I know now. That the quality the world mocked in her, the stillness, the way animals pressed their heads into her hands, the tendency to see frightened things clearly and speak to them without conditions, was never a flaw in need of correction. It was always the truest thing about her. It just needed someone, a wolf, a king, a patient woman with a mortar and pestle, a village healer who wrote careful letters in the dark, to look at it long enough to see it for what it was. The raven on the windowsill clicked its beak once. The apple blossoms held against the cold, and somewhere in the great keep of Vordenmere, the morning bell began to ring, steady and clear and unbothered, the way it always had, calling everyone to the work of the day. This time, I was not invisible when I answered it. This time, I was exactly where I was supposed to be.